of resource use decisions to All right. I think we are going to go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the Education Policy Seminar today. My name is Brian Kim and I'm a first-year doctoral student in the Education Policy program here at the Carrie School of Education. All right. Yeah, that's good. All right. I think we are going to go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to the Education Policy Seminar today. My name is Brian Kim and I'm a first-year doctoral student in the Education Policy program here at the Carrie School of Education. This talk is part of the Education Policy Seminar Series, which is sponsored by the Bankert Fund for Political Economy. Each semester, the Center on Education Policy and Workforce Competitiveness, or EdPolicyWorks, hosts a number of talks that are free and open to the public. For more information on EdPolicyWorks or the next seminar, please visit our website. Today, we are delighted to have with us Carrie Conaway, the Chief Strategy and Research Officer for the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. She speaks with over 15 years of experience in improving systems through evidence. She leads the agency's Office of Planning and Research, which helps the states and districts implement effective policy and programs and make effective resource use decisions to improve student outcomes. She has served as the agency's principal investigator on numerous evaluations of state education programs and policy, and notably led the development and implementation of the state's top-scoring $250 million Race to the Top proposal. She was recently appointed by President Barack Obama to the National Board for Education Sciences and is president-elect of the Association for Education Finance and Policy. Today, she will be speaking for approximately 1 hour and will leave 15 to 30 minutes for discussion or questions after. Please note that any additional or personalized questions after 12:30 p.m. can be addressed via email, as other meetings will be beginning at that time. So thank you all for attending the Education Policy Seminar today. Please join us for our next talk in the spring, and please join me in welcoming Carrie Conaway up to the podium.
Okay, thanks. Do you guys normally sit with all the faculty on one side and all the students on the other? Is that just a thing? Okay, just checking. Thank you guys so much for inviting me today. I'm really thrilled to be here. This is a gorgeous campus. It was really nice to have a chance to walk around, and I'm enjoying meeting with all the students. It's a lot of fun. And I'm excited to share some of our work, our recent work on teacher quality initiatives, and how that research actually gets used in practice, which I know is often the great mystery of those of you who are in a more academic setting of like how this actually works. So hopefully I can provide a little light on that issue and show you how it works in Massachusetts. And I'm actually happy if you interrupt me with questions, that's fine. And I can also answer questions at the end. And I'm also happy to answer questions that aren't directly about this particular topic if you have some more general question about state policy or whatever. So I want to talk about how research gets used in practice, but I think it's useful to do that through the context of a particular example to start with and then generalize. So that's how I'm going to approach this. I'm going to start with one of our research partnerships with Dan Goldhaber, Roddy Theobald, and James Cohen at Calder, which is the Center for Analysis for Longitudinal Data of Education Research, or something like that, having to do with educator quality broadly. So to me, any strong research partnership comes first from these three things: having good questions, good researchers, and some resources. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those three things in the context of this study, and then talk about what we learned from it. So in terms of the questions, the way our research agenda works at my agency is it really stems from our agency's strategic priorities, which are up here on the slide. So the research that we do is in service of getting this work done in the agency. For a long time, the research agenda was essentially like in my head. I kind of knew who was working on what and who was interested in what. But then I had this thought one day, I was like, maybe I should write it down. Maybe that would be better if it wasn't just me knowing everything. So I went through the exercise of writing down all the projects that we were working on and all the questions we had that we hadn't yet come up with answers for. And then I realized that we didn't have any research projects related to educator preparation, but we had a lot of questions. And I thought, we got to find some way to answer these questions. It was a really illuminating moment. But let me talk about why we had questions about educator preparation. This was probably 3 or 4 years ago, at which point the agency was on the tail end of the initial push of implementing a new way that teachers were evaluated in the state. So we spent probably 4 or 5 years working with districts around improving the quality of the evaluation process. And so the team was sort of turning its attention to preparation as a way to increase the quality of educators before they even get into practice, having spent some time on the practice side of it. And we knew from prior research that new teachers were likely to be less effective and disproportionately placed with the neediest kids. And we knew that preparation and licensure would be a lever, potentially, for helping to improve this by improving quality of the incoming educator workforce. So we had some program initiatives we were working on. We were working on completely redesigning the way educator preparation programs are approved in Massachusetts. Our agency is responsible for approving prep programs. And so we were working on the accountability system for that. We had won a Gates grant that had to do with more work around improving the quality of novice teachers. And so it was an area of increasing policy significance, which is why it was coming up on the research agenda. People are starting to ask a lot of questions about, well, what does this exactly look like in Massachusetts? How can we improve? And so that was how we ended up with that set of questions, which, yes?
Who put educator preparation on the agenda? You as the department are reacting to it. The state board? Is it the legislature? Who?
I would say in this case it was our, driving it ourselves. My colleague Heather Pesky runs all the work related to curriculum instruction and educator quality in her shop, and she felt really strongly like this was the next big thing we needed to be working on. We knew that our incoming educators were not nearly as strong as the ones who'd been there a while, and we felt like if we could improve the quality of the entry-level teacher to the point that they looked more like what our current second or third year teachers look like, it would make a big difference for kids. So obviously not always the case that that's why, but in this case it was really self-generated. So the big question we had was, how do workforce outcomes vary for Massachusetts teachers from different licensure pathways and preparation programs? And I'll talk about both of those. So that was the big thing we were interested in learning more about. In terms of the researchers, the reason that we wanted to work with Dan was that, for one thing, he had done a prior project with us, or actually one of his colleagues had. We've had this nightmarish data problem with our state test, where we've had different curriculum frameworks undergirding what is on the test, and then different tests over the last few years. And I had seen one of his colleagues present a paper at APAM that looked at, does teacher value added biased or otherwise screwed up when either curriculum frameworks change or assessments change? And he had done it in other states. And I said, hey, any chance you could add Massachusetts? Because that seems like an important question for us. By the way, the answer they got was that it didn't really matter a whole lot, that the value-added measures worked equally well, or roughly equally well. But so they had done some work with our data already, and then Dan has done a bunch of work in Washington State on prep and licensure. And so it's this nice confluence of they already knew our data at least a little bit. They had prior experience, so we weren't the first state they were working with on these types of research questions. So it was a nice mesh moment. And plus, I just really like Dan and like working with him, which is always a good reason to work with someone. Resources that are usually the hardest part of this, figuring out how to get the work done. In this case, it just fell into my lap, where quite possibly one of the weirdest phone calls I've ever gotten in my life, where the guy who was like the budget director for the Ways and Means Committee at the state legislature calls and says, do you want some money for research? And I was like, yes. Is there a no answer to this question? But he was feeling very frustrated that the legislature was funding all these initiatives and never really did evaluations, let alone cost-benefit analysis of whether they were actually paying off. And so he's coming from a budget perspective of like, is this a good way to invest our money? So they gave us $300,000 and required that we do at least 2 projects with that. So we ended up doing one on, we used to run an academic support program for kids who had either failed the state test or were at risk of failing the state test. And it was meant to get kids back on track so they could graduate. And I thought, well, if anything lends itself to cost-benefit analysis, it's something about the impact of having a kid graduate that wouldn't have otherwise graduated. That's a fairly straightforward thing. And then this one where I had this research question around ed prep, and I was like, I don't know exactly what the cost-benefit thing is, but we'll figure it out. I'm going to give Dan the money, and we'll come up with something that satisfies the legislature so that I can get this work done. And I'll touch on a little later how we handled the cost-benefit piece of it. But so in this case, that's how that happened. Not the most typical path. More often, it's either that my agency decides we're going to invest some money in hiring a researcher, or we approach a researcher and write a grant, or they come to us and they've already won a grant, they want to use our data. So it's not usually that the legislature just calls and gives me money out of nowhere, but that day, that was how that happened. So the first project that we worked on related to teacher policy with Dan was what we now call the Teacher Pathways Study. And we're interested in 3 outcomes. We're interested in value added for new teachers, their evaluation ratings. So remember I said we redid how teachers were evaluated. So this is their evaluation ratings under that new evaluation system, and then attrition out of the field. And then we're looking at 3 different types of licenses for new teachers and 3 different ways they can be prepared. I know it sounds like initial, preliminary, and temporary might all be the same thing, but in fact they are not. An initial license is sort of your typical undergrad education major going into the field directly. So the Curry School teacher prep, undergraduate teacher prep program is, you would get an initial license in Massachusetts coming out of that. Preliminary licenses are for people who maybe majored in something else but want to become teachers. MTEL, which is our state teacher test, and then you have, there's sometimes a few other like small requirements, but then you have 5 years, up to 5 years on a preliminary license, which you have to advance to initial. So preliminary is before initial. We now call this a provisional license because preliminary is a little confusing, but so these are teachers, like my husband has a license like this. He was an undergraduate economics major and then got a preliminary license as to be a teacher. He actually never used it, but just as an example. Temporary licenses are for teachers coming from out of state. If you've had at least 3 years of service in another state, you can get a temporary license, I think for a year, might be 2 years, something like that, so that you can get in, take the MTEL, and work while you're fulfilling those. For preparation programs, the undergraduate program is your typical undergrad degree. Postgrad would be like a master's in teaching type program. Alternative are generally more practice-based programs, things like Match Charter School has a teacher preparation program, the Boston Teacher Residency, things like that, usually sponsored by a district, not always, but so they're not typical higher ed institution based. They're based usually in a district or a charter school or something like that. So those are what we're looking at. Yes.
What do you have to do to get from initial to permanent or whatever the next step is?
So you have 5 years on an initial license, and then you have to do, there's like a bunch of PD requirements and like,
Is it a master's degree though, or just?
Usually, we also have a practice-based way to advance from initial, which actually is how we handle the cost-benefit thing, so I'll come back to that in the other, but almost every teacher essentially gets a master's degree. So, what did we learn? There's going to be a bunch of graphs that look like this, so I'm going to orient you to one, and then that'll hopefully carry you through for the next few. Here we're comparing the 3 different types of preparation programs. The green dot is the reference group. That's our undergraduate programs, and then the other 2 are relative to that. The little lines are 95% confidence intervals around the estimates. In this case, the y-axis is the summative rating. Teachers can be rated exemplary, proficient, needs improvement, or unsatisfactory. And so we just put those on a 4-point scale and then averaged. So this is just an average of those numbers. Yes?
Is there any overlap? So when you mentioned the alternative programs, you mentioned that mostly charter school pathways, and I know charter schools aren't evenly distributed across grades. So is there any sort of concentration across grades or subjects embedded in these, or no?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. My guess is that there is not, because the charter schools in Massachusetts do cover the range of grades and stuff. But it might be the case that some of them in the districts may have chosen, like, we're only going to do core academics through the alt program or something. I actually just don't know, so I should find out. Mm-hmm.
What are these, who's doing the ratings?
I didn't say, and it varies by the district or the school. Usually it's a principal, but sometimes, especially at the high school level, it'll be like a curriculum director or the math department lead or something like that. Sometimes it's an assistant principal if it's a school large enough to have one.
And it's just they just give them like 1 to 5?
Well, actually, in the case, so what happens in districts is we have, there's an overall summative rating, and then there's 4 I forget what we call them, strands or something underneath that. So they actually get ratings on the overall, on the 4 things underneath it. Some districts go so far as we actually have indicators that's even a level lower than that. That's like, there's like 30 of them or something, and some districts actually rate on all of those. What gets reported to us at the state is the overall and the 4 strands. And to be technical, what actually the researchers did here, the way Massachusetts teacher evaluation looks like, the vast majority of teachers are rated proficient. The tails are what we're identifying. There's about 6 to 8% of teachers in each tail, either exemplary or needs improvement and below. So not a lot of variation. You do see more variation at the strand level. So what these guys did is actually average the 4 strands together, so we get a little more variation to be able to differentiate programs. But yeah, then they just put it on a 1 to 4. Other questions? Okay. So what we're seeing here is that the summative programs are getting, the kids who have gone through those programs are typically getting higher ratings. I should say also, obviously, this is not causal. Like, this is just what is in the world. We did not randomly assign people to alternative programs. I would have loved to, and yet another one of my RCT ideas that failed. But we really just wanted to start with, just descriptively, to know what is the current circumstance in Massachusetts. So that was one thing we learned. We looked at value added a bunch of different ways. The top 2 are math is on the left, ELA on the right, baseline models, which are sort of like a more typical model, and then adding in fixed effects. And it kind of just, no big differences. You know, maybe on ELA, the post-grad programs look a little better, but nothing sort of popped out as like, wow, that looks like a really big difference. You can also see, by the way, that those alternative program estimates in general are really imprecise, which is because, in part, they're just N size, like there's a lot fewer students going through those programs, but also a lot of them are, you go through the matched charter prep program and then you teach in matched charter schools, and so they're identifying the differences based on a handful of weird people who like went through the match thing and then taught someplace else, and so the confidence intervals are just crazy. But even leaving aside the confidence intervals, the point estimates don't suggest large differences on any of these. So that was on prep programs. Now switching to licenses, we've got math value added, ELA value added, and then the summative rating back on that 1 through 4 scale. We do see that the people coming with the preliminary licenses, so again, these are the people who don't have an ed degree and are teaching, often have lower value added. Not huge. That point estimate is like minus 0.25 relative to the average. So it's not enormous, but a little bit different. And they have lower summative ratings. Again, not enormous, but somewhat lower. Yes?
Carrie, the summative ratings are unconditional, just straight means of...
Actually, that's a good question. Whether this is controlling for other stuff in this particular representation of the data. Knowing James, he controlled for other stuff. That may be like a prediction, once you've controlled for other things. I'd have to go back and check. This is the problem with presenting the research when you're not the person who did the research. It's like, I don't always know the technical stuff. I'm not entirely sure. Yep.
I don't know if this is technical or not, but are these all first-year teachers, or are you just any teacher that holds an initial license?
It's not all just, it's not just first year, it's people in the first few years of practice, because we needed to aggregate a few years of teachers together to have enough data, but then it's just that group, it's not everyone. But you can't be on a preliminary license for more than 5 years, so you can't be more than 5 years into practice. Yes?
With the temporary license, did you say that was like a minimum of 5 years teaching elsewhere?
Minimum of 3.
Okay, so they all have at least 3 years teaching.
Correct. So it's not terribly surprising to see that they get better ratings and do a little better because they have more experience. They should look more like a third-year teacher than a first-year teacher. So the other thing that's a little weird with the preliminary is, remember I said that you have to advance your license from preliminary to initial. So once you switch to initial, you'd then be in our initial estimate. So most teachers take the full 5 years on the preliminary because they've got to go get a master's degree and blah, blah, blah. But some switch earlier, so you have a little bit of weird selection issue where, like, once you get switched into the other group before 5 years go by. Again, if we could only randomly assign teachers to preparation programs. So then we were interested in attrition. Who are the teachers who are most likely to leave of this early group? Statewide, we have we've got some patterns here where we see that the programs that are generating, or pathways that look like they're the higher value added, better performing, often are the ones where the teachers are leaving more quickly, which is a bit of a bummer. So the alternative programs in particular, you can see are more likely. I mean, it's not, so it's a difference annually 6% of teachers leave from undergraduate programs. It's like 8% from alternatives. So a big percentage difference, not a huge percentage point difference, but it's not nothing. You know, it's like 30% more likely to leave. And the same thing, the teachers coming in on preliminary licenses or temporary are more likely to leave than those who are on initial. Yes?
Is this just sort of simpler, or are you able to look at programs like either Massachusetts or public school?
They don't show up in our public school data anymore. So they could go to a private school, they could go out of state. We don't know, but they aren't teaching in a Massachusetts public school.
I'm just trying to understand, I'm trying to reconcile the two. It seems like the attrition is much higher on the right-hand side. So it seems like overall. So are there people who are in the left-hand side that aren't in the right-hand side?
Yeah, I do understand what you're saying. Probably that's what's going on. I think, or it could also be that these are sort of conditional models, so I don't know. Yes?
I'm just wondering how much Massachusetts has to compete with nearby states for teachers, because it's like such a small area that someone like living in Vermont and teaching in Massachusetts, vice versa, or that, and, you know, like those temporary ones, I'm wondering especially about.
Yeah, you know, we have no way to know. That's the thing, you know, because we don't have, for example, like the home address of the teacher to know whether they're commuting in from out of state. Certainly, I would think on the northeastern part where you're getting close to New Hampshire, there's probably flow back and forth. Our salaries tend to be higher, so we're probably net importing, would be my guess. But there's no way to really know for sure. Other questions? Next time I'm bringing James with me. Okay, so this was one of the most interesting things we did. We actually then broke out the value added by the preparation program. So we have about 90 preparation programs in the state, meaning like Bridgewater State or UMass Lowell. And then within them they have, you know, elementary, special ed, 5th through 8th grade or whatever. But this is just the institutions, not the individual degree programs. And so we actually calculated what's the average value added for each of those programs and put in the two. So again, these are 95% confidence intervals. And there were a couple of things that were really surprising here. One was that we could actually differentiate some programs. So the blue ones are ones where the 95% confidence interval is above the 0, meaning so this is all relative to the average in the state. We have a handful that are high, and then the red ones are the ones that are below. Dan has told me that in other states where they've looked at this, often you can't tell any of them apart from one another, and so we do have some tails. We have more programs in general, so part of it may just be mechanical. But we also have some really interesting models that I think and sometimes seem to be associated with either very high or very low performance. One thing that was a little tricky about this was that the rank order you got depended on which way you modeled it. So for example, if you include student fixed effects, you get slightly different top and bottom programs. So it was a little tricky to talk about this with researchers, or actually with the policymakers. And in fact, you notice that we did not rank order these. That was in part because this is the very first time we've shown our preparation programs any data like this, and we didn't want them immediately to gravitate towards who's which one or whatever. We thought, let's just show them what is. And we actually also, in this case, we gave them their own individual reports. So as a prep program, they would know, like, I'm this dot, you know, but they wouldn't know which the other dots were. They just knew where they were relative to others. Yes?
So, Carrie, if I understood correctly, you've lumped together for an institution, all of the preparation areas in which they prepare teachers.
Yes.
And so I guess I'm wondering, in particular with the positive and negative institutions, whether they are specializing in certain areas. I mean, it seems a little, if I'm one of these institutions, I'm a little concerned that you're comparing me against a program that only does something that's very specific, and I've got a whole range of different programs, for example, that it's not really an apples to apples comparison.
Right, and that could absolutely be the case. We didn't dig to that next level yet. We just wanted to start with this. I will say that some of the ones that are very high, the very positive outliers, are things like these alt programs where they're training teachers to serve in the matched charter schools, which is a particular student population. It's different programs because they've got K through 12, so different licenses, but a particular kind of kid. So absolutely on that direction, they are serving a particular niche that may not be completely comparable to a Bridgewater state that's trying to prepare all the different possible licenses. So yeah. Yeah, and then also, I could have put math up here. It looks pretty similar, but there might be places that are particularly good at training math teachers and not so good at training English teachers, for example. But
yeah, but it also, the point you're making, this also gets to the issue of how much of this is actually the preparation program and how much of it is the settings in which they're placed, which we know from a whole bunch of other literature in Massachusetts that some of these
exactly
are extraordinarily good at, performance with kids.
Yeah, and we can't differentiate the selection into the program, what happens in the program, and where they get placed. It's all in this. So that's one of the next things we'd like to be able to get better at. We just have not gotten there yet. So did I see a hand over there? Someone else?
I was going to ask quickly, do you remember if the math, like the one that's high in ELA is also high in math? Do you happen to remember, or was there a correlation there?
They did often look similar. Not always. What flipped stuff around more was the way you modeled it, whether you had the student fixed effects in there or not, shifted the rank order more than the subject. So, what else was I going to say about this? Oh, by the way, these are decent size, positive. Some of these are like, if you translate that into weeks of learning, 9 weeks, 20 weeks, I mean, it's big. And then on the negative end is 5 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, So it was really useful for us as a result because, I think this is my next slide. All right, so we saw big variation across programs, more so than in other states. We saw higher attrition from the non-traditional pathways, but those were often the more effective. But the thing that was really helpful was that it validated that prep is a good policy lever here, right? Because we've got this high tail end that we can learn something from and help infuse those practices elsewhere. And we have enough range around it that it's not like everybody kind of looks the same no matter what. There are things we can learn. So it was really, it's a very initial, very descriptive analysis, but a good first start down things that are going to help us ultimately improve our licensure policy and improve our preparation programs. So I think probably the biggest thing we learned is we have a lot more questions, and you guys have raised a bunch of them, and then we have many, many more. So the next thing we did, and actually occurs to me, I think I took, yeah. So the next thing we did was figure out how we're going to deal with this cost-benefit thing, right? Because we've got to do something that satisfies that. So we have this, as I said, most candidates, once they're on their initial license, the way they get their professional license is they do a master's degree. But we have a practice-based option in some districts where it's essentially more of a portfolio model and a combination of some PD and stuff like that, but you don't have to do the full master's degree. And it's a lot cheaper because you basically just pay for, there's like a fee to have your portfolio evaluated, and you have to pay for some PD credits and whatever, but it's a lot cheaper. And you're still teaching, which means you don't have the opportunity cost of not teaching during the year or two that you're in your prep program. So we're just finishing up, which is why I don't have a slide on it. We have not quite finished the analysis, but that's how we handled the cost benefit, is taking a look at that program and then looking to see cost benefit, whether it looks like it's valuable or not. So if you're interested, call me in like a month. I'm reading the draft on the way home on the plane, so we're almost done. Yes?
How are so you have presented this to the program, to the institution.
Mm-hmm.
How are they feeling about this? Are they seeing that this is something that they feel they're a partner in, that is something that can potentially benefit them, or?
That's a really great question. It
want to do anything, dig and find these things, you leverage the good and the bad, improve it, or whatever.
Yeah.
They've got to buy into the
right. So we benefited on this project from the fact that our program staff have built a really good relationship with those prep programs over time. That being said, data is like the one thing that makes everyone anxious, right? So, and this is the first time they'd seen anything like this. And their worry always, and it's the same with our districts, is, are you going to hold me accountable for this? That's the first thing they want to know, which is not currently the intent. I mean, this was really just meant to help inform us and find where can we find good examples. Ultimately, we do report cards or public reporting about prep programs. We may at some point decide this is good enough to report there. But so it's interesting, actually, when James presented the findings to the prep programs, this is James Cowan, who's one of the researchers at AIR in Calder who did this. He's very calming, which is a good thing, I think, because I think he tamped down a lot of the like, what is this, you know. Anne was just super clear, way better than I am at explaining these. Anne actually knows the answers to all the technical questions, which is great. But nonetheless, like, it was a little hard to read because it was a webinar. It was a little hard to read what's the reaction to this. We then later heard some concerns about how we accounted for teacher experience in the model. So I'm not totally sure what the conversation is right now with the prep programs about, like, how much they've grabbed onto this. I think, you know, our intent is to continue to do this work and try to iteratively improve it, and we do a lot of work with prep programs around data, so I think we'll build to a better place than we're in, and I don't think we're in a bad place, but it's a little, there's always hesitance when it comes to that.
So to Jim's question earlier about something like match versus a more undergrad
Mm-hmm.
and this question of buy-in, do you hear from the traditional programs, like, there aren't people knocking on the door wanting to be teachers, we can't be particularly selective and choosy, isn't it? There's not this question of like fit that there would be in a place like match where someone
Mhm.
is taking a particular pathway in a particular kind of school they want to work in number. I'm just thinking about outcomes in Virginia. I think traditional programs, that would be the narrative.
Mm-hmm. It could be. That would be a better question to ask my program staff who interact with them more. I haven't personally heard them say that, but it's very possible. I could certainly imagine somebody saying that. Other questions? Okay. So one of the big questions we were really interested in was how teachers get assigned to students. Because when you think about the resources in a district, primarily it's their human capital of the teachers that they have. And to me, there's really no more important resource use decision than which teacher gets which kids. And so now, having built this stream of research with these guys on educator policy issues, we had the data organized in a way that we could then take a look at this other question about teacher equity gaps, or sort of how the assignment of teachers to students. So that was one of the next big things we did with these guys. We did a policy brief. I feel like maybe it got distributed to you guys. Am I remembering that right? Or some people are nodding. Okay. So this is a new thing we're trying. I'd love to hear your feedback on it, actually, where my thought was there are lots of places where we have existing research, often national research, where we know a particular issue is of concern. We have some quantitative data, but we don't always know what it looks like in Massachusetts. And so I thought it might be helpful to have a brief that summarizes what do we know from literature and then the Massachusetts data context to put it in perspective. So that was what we're trying to do with this teacher equity policy brief. I wanted to highlight a couple things that particularly stood out for us. We've just finished this in the last couple months, so we haven't yet figured out how we're going to respond to these findings, but we have, we're learning and we're trying to find. One thing that really surprised me was that if you compare the 60th percentile versus the 50th percentile teacher on a value-added measure, that 60th percentile teacher is getting 4 weeks more a year of learning out of their kids than a 50th percentile, which struck me as a pretty large difference. It doesn't seem impossible to me to improve a teacher from the 50th percentile to the 60th percentile. I mean, it's not a tiny jump, but it's not so big that it feels like beyond what you could hope to accomplish through professional development and coaching and feedback. And so that was actually really good news to me, that we could, if we were strategic about how we worked on the quality of our teacher workforce, it wouldn't be hard to get everyone up to a little bit higher performance. Another thing that really stood out to me, this was not the focus of the report, but those of you who have read it will remember that in the back we actually summarized some policy initiatives you could do that would help improve teacher quality. Because to me, if you've got an equity gap, either you need to change who's assigned to whom, or you need to make your teachers better. And either one of those will help solve. So one thing we talked about was early hiring, because we've seen national research that showed that teachers hired later are typically less effective. And so on a whim, at the last minute, I was like, hey, James, I'm just curious, how many of these novice teachers in our data set were hired late? Almost a third of them were hired after September 15th. So they've missed the PD days, they've missed whatever summer prep they might have done. They've missed the first 2 weeks of school. Who knows who was teaching the first couple of weeks? Now, this is obviously any point after September 15th, so they could have been brought in as a second semester sub, or, it's not necessarily right in September. but boy, we're putting them in a hard position to be successful, right? You know? So this was something that we're like, we really need to think about how to help our districts improve their hiring process so that they're not scrambling at the last minute and then slotting in novice teachers that late. And then when that does happen, we need to think about what sort of support should districts be providing to teachers who are hired in this obviously unpleasant circumstance. Yes?
Do you know what the distribution of that looked like? Because I can imagine like some schools in some districts had much higher proportions of that than others in other districts. And then that would probably speak a little bit more to sort of where you want to concentrate the resources.
Yep, we don't know yet because, like I said, this was literally a last minute, hey, James, run this number. So, but that is absolutely the first question was like, is this consistent statewide or is it just in certain places? So we know in Boston, they used to have a big problem with this. And it had to do with the way their teacher contract was written. And then the superintendent realized there was this like little used provision in there that allowed him more flexibility to hire early. So they've done a big push and don't hire so late. So my guess is some of this data may have been driven by Boston because it would have been from, at least part of it is in this prior period, but I haven't looked anywhere else to know. Somebody else had a hand. Yep.
I was just wondering if you could contextualize that a little bit, like what percent of the workforce are novice teachers?
Something like, I want to say it's like 10 or 15%. And so novice in this case is like within the first 5 years of teaching, I think. So maybe it's more than that. It might be more like, if it's the first 5, it might be more like 30%, something like that. So,
One thing that would be interesting to have to consider as we move forward on that, around the working with districts to change their hiring. We had a teacher shortage summit here in October, and there was a panel of several divisions, Virginia, we call it divisions, representatives who were involved in hiring, and they all were talking about how they had vacant positions then that were handled in October. And the way they expressed it was not that they had people in the pool, they just hadn't gotten their systems organized in the classroom, but that the pool was empty and they were trying to, like the reason,
yeah, and that could very well be, yeah.
is this sort of the divisions, the districts may have some efficiencies, but there's this whole like marketing, like where were these novice teachers, where were these teachers who were hired after the 50s, what were they doing before then? Were they looking for it, just not what they were hired?
Right, were they maybe finishing up a program with a summer course or something so they weren't eligible yet? Or yeah, it's an excellent question. And again, we don't know, but I would love to do some discussions with districts around, tell us about your hiring. How exactly does this work? Because it made the findings we were seeing with the novice teachers being so much lower, much less surprising. Once I understood, I was like, oh gosh, we're starting them with 2 steps behind in the race. So, but really this last point was what we were trying to focus on with these teacher equity gaps around low-income students and who gets assigned to which teachers. We have these super cool reports that we've done that look at, for different types of kids, how likely they are to have different kinds of teachers. So, you can do it by low income or by English language learner or low performing on MCAS or whatever. How likely are they to have a teacher who has at least 3 years of experience relative to the opposite group? How likely are they to have a teacher with who's got at least a proficient rating on the evaluation? And part of the reason I wanted to do this policy brief was to illuminate why districts should care about that. So then we wanted to include some of these statewide findings also because districts see their own reports, but it's harder for them to know what this looks like as a state as a whole and how aberrant or non-aberrant they are. So I pulled out a couple of the findings here. This one is the value-added model, where we're looking at assignment of low-income kids to teachers of different value-added. So a typical low-income kid is getting assigned to a teacher that adds 1 fewer week than average of learning, and then a non-low-income kid is getting a teacher that's about 0.7 weeks above average. So then the gap is 1.7 weeks, right? And we can have a whole discussion about how we translated the effect sizes into weeks, which I'm happy to have. But nobody's going to understand if I put this as like 0.1 standard deviation, so we have to have some sort of translation. On ELA, it's a little bigger, 3.6 weeks. So these are, not enormous, but 3.6 weeks is 10% of a school year. And then this is every year, right, potentially. The impact isn't linear, so it's not like it is literally linearly cumulative. It sort of tails off, but nonetheless, over time, this can really substantially increase gaps.
And this is done at the student level, not the school level?
Yeah, student level. Then we also looked at likelihood of being assigned to a teacher rated low or a teacher with less experience. And so you can see that not very many kids are assigned to teachers rated below proficient because there aren't very many teachers rated below proficient, but the low-income kids are twice as likely to get a low-rated teacher. So it's like 2.5% versus, or 3% versus 6%, something like that. In terms of experience, they're 30% more likely to have a teacher with less than 3 years of experience. So all of these things, to me, I think help our districts and our program staff focus attention where this issue is. And the thing that's a little challenging about this particular issue is that we also had them look at what's driving this. Is this district level, school level, or classroom level assignment? The majority of this is happening at the district level. About 75–80% of these inequities are because our less effective teachers are in the districts where the low-income kids are, as opposed to that a district is not fairly assigning within a district or course. That being said, it's still 25% that is being driven at the district and school level, and they at least have agency and ability to influence that. And then that helps us inform for policy. We need to help ensure that we're increasing the quality of educators statewide, because that's how we're going to have to fix this problem. That's mainly where the issue is. Jim?
Can you go back to the slide on value added?
Yep.
So my rough translation, which may be different than yours, that the math value added is about 0.02 standard deviation. The ELA is about 0.04.
Something like that, yeah.
0.05 standard deviation. So in some sense, not nothing, but not big, right?
Right.
And so that sort of leads me to think about why that might happen. My priors going into an exercise like this would be that, especially based on sort of a long history of research around inequity of teacher assignment to students, is that we would see these things being much larger. So it sort of leads me to wonder, getting under the hood a little bit, you can imagine that there are, low income, if this is free and reduced price. I know you want to get down to the policy discussion, but what I'm a little worried about here is that presented this way, it makes these gaps seem small, not
right,
nothing, but not big.
Right.
And then I begin to worry a little bit about how we're measuring some of these low-income measures. I'm also worrying about which districts, which places are we including. For example, I would expect, where would I expect these gaps to be the biggest? And so my priors would be in places where union contracts and other mechanisms preclude the more even distribution or makes it harder to get more even distribution. So I guess maybe this is where you're heading. I would want to know a lot more and maybe highlight what I see as the places where these gaps might be much larger than is depicted here, and describe the problem that way rather than looking at sort of a statewide average, an average together, lots of places where we get a lot of income kids in medium-sized towns. I wouldn't expect that's the place where we see a lot of segregation by income and race, for example.
Right.
So maybe thinking about going to the places where we expect those gaps to be largest and then seeing how big are they in those places.
Yeah, it'd be a great follow-on piece. It also is, so it's interesting you framed that that I want to get onto the policy piece, because I think that is the policy piece. That's exactly the question, right? Is where is this happening and why? Those reports that I described, I think, are going to help districts a lot with that, because they will be able to see in my district what does this look like, and it will immediately illuminate, because we do see, although these aren't huge, there are places where it's larger. So hopefully that will generate the discussion that we really need, which is really for districts to change their practice. And in some districts, this isn't an issue, so they don't need to prioritize it, but in other cases. It is an interesting question you raise about the framing of it, and we were surprised that they were this small, actually.
But this is pretty consistent. I've had this conversation with Dan a couple times, because Dan finds the same sort of gaps in Washington. I think the Mathematica stuff would suggest that in the places they've looked at, it's even smaller than this.
Yeah.
And that's my worry, is that policy people look at this and they say, these gaps are big. People make this big to do about it, and it's not that big. We'd rather be worrying about 18 other things. And I think that's sort of the because we frame them this way, it misses what I think is the potential point that these are much larger in some places,
Yeah.
but mostly not a problem in many places.
Yeah, I wonder if we could. One thing we did that sort of relates to what you said, but not exactly, is we looked at the cumulative effect over a bunch of years, where you do see it starts to get to a number that you're like, ooh, oh, you know. But we didn't do the subgroup type analysis that you're describing here. It'd be really interesting to follow up. I'm sure James would love to do it. So, what am I talking about now? Okay, so I started by saying the 3 prerequisites you have to have are good questions, good researchers, and good resources. But what makes it successful, I think, is about the burning question. So not just a question, but like a really important question that we need to do something about. Focus on continuous improvement, I think, is really important. The sort of autopsy-style report where, like, at the end you find out why the patient died is not so helpful. My job is to improve the quality of education of kids, not to figure out why they didn't get a good one later. So things like this teacher prep and licensure stuff, which maybe isn't the sexiest thing, it's not going to get anybody tenure, but really helps inform our work, and then we can build towards stuff that maybe is a little more sophisticated analytically. Another thing that's really important is just what do the deliverables look like and the timelines. Dan has been great about being very responsive to, like, we've got a seminar coming up or an event with the policymakers, we need to have such and so a finding by this point. Doing, for example, like I described, giving every prep program their own report goes a long way to getting people engaged in the data. Doing the policy brief format rather than the more traditional research piece. We worked really, really hard on, even on the long teacher prep report, which is like 100 pages, making the executive summary really snappy so people could read just that. Tim Taylor, who edits the Journal of Economic Perspectives, has I'm not going to get it exactly right, but he says that introductions are worth 4 times the effort that people typically put towards them, and opening paragraphs of sections are worth double the effort, and conclusions are worth 3 times the effort, because that's what policymakers read. And being able to concisely describe your findings is really critical. And that's what causes findings, I think, to help inform policy and practice. So I've given you an N of 1 that research does influence policymaking, but it happens more. And so I want to shift a little bit to the broader, but I'm happy to answer more questions about this particular project first. No? Nobody wants to ask me about the standard errors or anything like that? Okay. So, I think when people when researchers talk about how they envision research getting used in policymaking, it often seems like, to me, this very overly simplistic model. I think they think, like, I'm sitting around at my desk, and then the researcher's like, here you are, here's my study. And then I go, oh, thank you so much, sage from on high. And then I go do something, and then the world is better. Or maybe you think, I'm sitting around my desk going like, I wonder how I should handle this. Maybe I should read a book, or maybe a lit review, or whatever. I'll go to the library, and then I do something differently, and then the world is happy. But, this is absurd on its face, right? This is just not how a decision is ever made. None of you have made decisions like this. In the first model, really, that's like, you don't want a policymaker to make the decision on the basis of one study. That doesn't make sense. You want to look at an accumulation of evidence. And even in the second case, even if there is an accumulation of evidence, that doesn't necessarily mean it's relevant for the context. It might depend on your state or your district or which kids you want to serve or those sorts of things. And I think also a lot of the questions that policymakers need answers to don't have direct evidence of the type that this model envisions. But that does not mean we don't use research to inform our thinking. So I want to show you sort of what that looks like. One type of research is the impact evaluation, thumbs up, thumbs down, did it work or not. That absolutely is useful. We've commissioned a bunch of projects like that. And when we can do them, it's great. That's always really, really helpful. But we also need things like descriptive analysis. And the reason I put this 37% up here is because this is from about the first time we had linked up our K-12 data with the higher ed data in the state. And so we knew that the state public higher ed had high remediation rates, but we didn't know for the kids who were going Mass public high school to Mass public college what the remediation rate was. And admittedly, the publics mainly serve kids from the, it wasn't a stretch of imagination to think that it was probably pretty similar, but there's nothing like knowing that that number is 37% to cause policymakers to change. So when we did this analysis, it ultimately led to a change in the admissions policies at the higher education institutions. You now can't, because the reason this was happening, the reason the remediation rate was so high, appeared to be that kids often weren't taking math in their senior year, and so they would have had a year off from math, and then they go to take the AccuPlacer or whatever, fail the AccuPlacer, have to take a remedial course, and we thought it would be helpful if they at least took math in the senior year. So now to get into a four-year college in Massachusetts, you have to take math in your senior year, and you have to have 4 years of math in total. And that was, I mean, I'm not going to take full credit, but it was in large part because we found out that the kids who are coming from our public high schools were not prepared well for college. So that was just a descriptive number, nothing fancy, but made a big difference. Another thing I would say is what I call the alchemy of program of implementation. Learning from variation. So the prep program report that I was just discussing is a great example of that, where we're really interested in, like, can we identify prep programs that are doing something interesting? Or can we identify ones that are particularly weak? And so that we can learn from those things. And that's, I think, where that real-time stuff is especially important, because it helps you iteratively improve. I mean, I can think of in, for example, in school turnaround, we've done some stuff that helps us get at what's the difference between among the low-performing schools. Some do improve and some don't. And we can look qualitatively by looking at program reviews and classroom observations to get a sense of what's different in those schools. And it's not a causal impact, it's not a descriptive thing, it's more about the program implementation, but we really learn a lot from that. Stakeholder perceptions matter an awful lot. We're working in a political environment. We need to understand what people think about our work. A good example of this, and a couple of you heard it a little earlier, it was when we implemented that educator evaluation initiative that I was describing, we did some representative sample surveys of teachers in the state to understand what they thought about this initiative. We were hearing this sort of narrative from squeaky wheels of, like, the system isn't fair, but if you don't do a comprehensive representative survey, you don't know, is that a typical belief or is that just the people we're hearing from? And what we learned was actually, it was fascinating, was that if you ask teachers, do you think your own evaluation was fair? It was more than 90% would agree or strongly agree with that. If you ask them, do you think the system is fair? It was more like 2/3 would agree. But that was super helpful for our commissioner, because then he could go, when he was speaking with teacher audiences, to say, I hear that many of you are concerned about the fairness, but by the way, almost all of your peers think that this system is fair. And it helps shift the narrative in a way that if we hadn't collected that data, we would have just been like, I guess people don't think it's fair, and we would have changed it, or, you know. So we were able to make a better decision and message better because of having done stakeholder perception. All of these, in a way, there are versions of that sort of instrumental use of research where you're like, learn X, do Y, you know. But I think research, perhaps the most important use of research is what Carol Weiss calls the conceptual use of research, which is more changing the way you think. So it's not that you're necessarily commissioning something that's going to answer this particular question. It's more like you hear about a stream of findings along the way that all sort of relate to something. So I can give you two examples of that. One is the way we think about dual enrollment these days, by which I mean kids that are in K-12 but also taking a college-level course of some way. And when I was a kid, that was perceived as like the thing the smart kids did, right? That was not, it was really not accessible to a lot of kids. And these days we see a lot of districts really using that as an engagement strategy to keep kids interested in school. And that's because of research that demonstrates that it can be effective that way. It wasn't any one particular study, but sort of a stream of things suggesting that that was effective. Another, I would say, the educator effectiveness and evaluation work that many states took on over the last, I don't know, close to a decade at this point, is because of research that showed that giving teachers more effective feedback could help improve their practice. So that was, you know, it wasn't, I mean, the widget effect, measures of effective teaching study, plenty of other research, Cincinnati research, you know, lots of findings pointing in that direction help change how policymakers think about that as a lever. So I think that's actually, you know, I know researchers, I think, often feel that you wonder whether anybody's paying attention, you know. policymakers do pay attention. I think sometimes it's hard to see it, right? It's hard to measure this use of research. And I think also the things that are very visible, that have gotten really political, are probably the least likely places where you're going to see this happening. But I think you do see a lot of this in cases where it's maybe not so visible, but it's like some person in an agency or in a district that's running a program and they want to know how to improve their work, and they're paying attention to research that is informing that. It's not going to be the only thing that factors into their decision. They're going to also be concerned about what stakeholders think. They're going to be concerned about resources and all those things, but it's going to have an influence. Similarly with legislatures, they're never going to cite the study that influenced their, it's hard to see it, but it does affect research. So maybe someday I'll figure out a better way to measure that, because I think you all should be a little more encouraged with your work than you are. So, yes?
So I really like this idea, like the direction of sort of conceptual pieces of research. The question that I had for you, and also sort of for legislators, since you're working, on the ground level in terms of translating research and policy, is how do you think about sort of confirmation bias, and whether you see confirmation bias as something that is an issue?
That's such a good question. Oh, boy. Yes, I'm sure that happens. I don't know.
Like you deal with when you work with legislators that sort of have like a predisposition towards one view are sort of more excited to see certain types of research than other types of research. And I guess the other flip side of that is, have you ever seen the reverse happen, basically, where a legislator had sort of, preconceived idea coming into, a decision, and then sort of through talking about research and, was able to change their opinion?
So I almost never interact with our legislators, so I can't answer that directly. I can, though, talk about my colleagues at the agency, so the people who run the programmatic work. And I actually emailed out, maybe it was after Dan Goldhaber's ultra bummer AAFP presidential speech. It was something where he was all down on research, nobody pays attention to data. And so I emailed the senior executives, and I said, so can you give me an example of a time you changed something because of what data? And each one of them, in their own way, could give me at least one or two examples of a place where they learned something and it changed what they did. So I will be the first to admit that Massachusetts is an exceptionally nerdy state. We are maybe not the most typical state agency, but I do think that in my context, at least, evidence at least is in the conversation. I don't want to speak to anybody else. I can't claim, but I would say that, when I think about, for example, our Secretary of Education right now, so we currently have a Republican governor, and he appoints the Secretary of Education. So the Secretary is pretty conservative relative to most of my colleagues, right? He's Massachusetts Republican is like a unicorn, right? But so Jim comes with a particular perspective, particularly around school choice, charter school, that kind of stuff. That being said, he's convincible by data, and that if you show him data that will shift, he will shift a bit, So that's really all you can ask for, right? So, good question, though. Yes, Jim.
So I'm perfectly willing to buy, in fact, do buy the fact that Massachusetts is predisposed to being convinced. In general, the legislature, the policy community in Massachusetts is predisposed to being convinced by evidence. And I don't know whether you have a view on others, but so, for example, the fact that you exist in Massachusetts, there are not Conaways in most states, or in fact in very many states. And so, to me, that's a signal about the potential openness to evidence.
Yeah.
So it isn't, by accident that your job exists, and then you are able to, effectively leverage the use of evidence in these discussions. And so I guess I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about how states that maybe aren't at that place yet can get to that place, and what people like us might do in helping that process move along.
Yeah. Well, thank you. First, I've been really heartened by the number of states who have been calling me recently interested in putting in a role like mine. I've been there almost 11 years, and the first 5 or so, literally no agency had a me besides me. So I was just inventing how to do things, which is a terrible way to do your job because you mess stuff up all the time because you don't have a person to sort of bounce ideas off of. Tennessee hired Nate Schwartz about 6 years ago, and he has a virtually identical job to mine, but in Tennessee. And it totally changed my world because I had a person to talk to. And Nate is exceptionally thoughtful and smart, so if you ever get a chance to, maybe next year you can invite him and he'll say everything I was wrong. But he and I improve each other's work because we have this connection, right? But in the last few years, Ohio and Delaware have hired. Michigan has sort of a slightly different model, but they do have a research partner. I just in the last couple of weeks talked with people in Louisiana, Illinois, Utah. So it's growing a bit, which I think is encouraging. I'm interested to see, maybe one of you can do a study on what are the contextual things that enable people to succeed or not succeed. I really benefit from the fact that we have a relatively unpolitical way of choosing our commissioner. So it's not churning frequently, and we have had, like, our previous commissioner served for 8 years. The one before him was like 10 years. So you can have a direction that doesn't shift a lot, which I think helps. We have a lot of universities in the area. We have a lot of folks who value data. I don't know how you measure that in the context of another place, but I think that it also benefits me trying to find people to help do the research. I've got tons of people to choose from. When I talk with states about how to build this type of thing, my usual recommendation is just like pick something to work on. There's this huge range of things that agencies do, but you want to pick, I think, a project that's something that's sufficiently visible and important that people are going to pay attention without being so political that it's going to potentially derail the conversation. When I look back on it, the very first research project that I did, literally on my first day of work, my boss hands me a list of stuff to do, and on it is get a study going about the impact of charter schools in Massachusetts. Now, if you could pick a more political topic, it is unclear to me, but I had no idea. I had no education background. I was like, sure, charter schools, sounds great. And so I look back and I think, God, we were lucky that didn't just totally blow up the research shop because, we had external researchers there. That wasn't my team doing that. We had a team at MIT and Harvard doing that work, but that could have really gone badly. So I don't know that I would recommend charter schools as a topic, but I would pick something where you have some hope of doing a causal analysis and an implementation analysis. The best projects we've done are ones where we have a bit of both. And then the other thing I would say is, lately there's all this talk about research practice partnerships, and which is essentially how I do my work. But I think the archetypal or sort of highest order version of that is actually really hard. And so I wouldn't start there. Like, I start with every one of the projects that I have that I would call a true RPP, this being one of them, started with a single project that wasn't intended to be anything more than that single project, because you need to work with the person, get to know them. Can you trust them? Do they communicate effectively? I don't know that you can predict well without doing some work with the person which ones are going to be the most fruitful. So I was saying to a couple of the students earlier that I've decided instead of strategic planning, I'm going to do strategic doing, where I do stuff but then learn from it. And that's, to me, because I just don't know how you could predict well which relationships are going to build to something like that. Yep. Daphne, since you haven't asked before.
So, because of the reputation of your department as somewhere where researchers can go and do work, I can get lots of requests to do work.
We do.
From lots of different kinds of people, and I know you've reached out to qualitative research.
Yep.
So how do you think about kind of who to agree to, and how do you respond to these requests that maybe are not something that you sought out, but something somebody else sought out, or just how do you kind of think of the portfolio and not too much?
That's changed over time. So when I started, I was basically, anybody who wanted to work with our data that had a question that was even remotely related to something, I was like, sure, sounds great, because I wanted to build a lot of possible relationships. The thing I did wrong then that I've changed is I should have been connecting people more tightly with the program office from the beginning. So people would approach me with a question, be like, sure, sounds interesting. And it wouldn't occur to me like, wouldn't it be helpful if the person who actually runs that program talked to that researcher, to help them, first of all, inform the work? Because there's often like important implementation details about programs that I'm just never going to know. So I can't well advise the researcher on how to account for those in the work. And the policy or the program people often have really interesting questions that the researcher, had they known it was a question, could address. So we've more increasingly gone in that direction. I also am trying now more to kind of have my go-to people on each of the agency strategies and not have quite so many proliferating projects, because it creates a burden on the program staff. It's hard for them to continually have to explain their work to other people, and it's easier if we can, now that I've got enough relationships that I know which ones work well, I can build out a stream and a plan and sort of cover, and we can write grants, and it's easier to get the resources that way. So I've shifted that a bit over time. I actually, this year for the first time, we publish a research agenda, and I used to publish the whole thing, and then I realized I was just getting inundated with researchers. It's a good problem to have. It's a really good problem to have. I was like, I can't actually, we have enough partners at this point. So now what I'm more saying is here's kind of what we're working on. We'll let you know if something comes up, because you never know. Our legislature just a week and a half ago just changed the law around how English language learners can be served in the state. So that's a project that I wouldn't have had on my list, but now that they've done that, I'm going to need a research partner to help us figure that out, so we'll look for someone to do that. But I'm not as actively soliciting new stuff. That being said, I am never going to be the person who's going to come up with every clever research project. And so I'm always willing to at least hear the proposal and then decide, rather than just don't even talk to me, because we have lots and lots and lots of questions. I feel like I left out part of your question. Did I leave something out? No. Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Kind of related to what you were just saying, and also the flip side of that question is, how do you decide which research questions or projects that you have on your agenda that you want to outsource to a partner instead of doing it internally?
Yeah, it's a combination of a few things. One of them is what's the turnaround type of pace on it? So, for example, when we're designing our accountability system, it makes no sense for an external researcher to work on that, because it's we've got super tight timelines that we need to be working on. A question about the impact of the system, maybe, but the design of the system, which is a fairly research-oriented task, analytical task, we just would never, it would just be a nightmare. I can't even imagine. Another is, if it's real political, it's better if it's external, because, so for example, in the charter school thing, because in Massachusetts the state is the charter school authorizer, people perceive us as being pro-charter, and it's better to have it be an external researcher, where we gave them the data, we didn't say we had to approve the findings, we just said make sure it's not releasing confidential data, but we're not going to review for content, it's just for, and I think a third thing would be if it's a very resource-intensive task, which could be either very sophisticated quantitative analysis or qualitative, because it's so time-consuming. I just don't have the staff to do that kind of thing. So those are probably the most common places where we go external. Internal, if it involves relationships with districts, sometimes it's better if we do it ourselves, where you kind of need to know the person or whatever. The faster turnaround stuff. Things where we know we're going to be implementing a system over time. So for example, we do a predictive modeling early warning indicator system where we're predicting for every kid in the state how likely they are to meet whatever the next academic milestone. And we run that internally, although we started that as a project with a researcher to help us design the system, but then we built our capacity to be able to continue it because we knew we were going to have to produce these reports every year. Did you have a question?
Yeah, and to some extent it's been answered, but my question is about the process. So when you have a partner and his group, how many touch points are there along the way? Do I feel iterative where you're asking particular questions and they're responding to them? Because I think Chip and I have done work with different districts with different kinds of models for sharing. So I'm just wondering how you think about it and whether or not it looks consistent across questions and if you have particular approaches to do better.
So you've given me an entree point to tell my favorite story, which is, I call it a tale of two projects. This is so, when I first arrived to the agency, also on my list of things besides the charter school was, we had an evaluation that had already started before I arrived of our expanded learning time program, which was a state program that still exists. In any given year, we're funding about 20 or 25 schools to expand the school day by about 300 hours, and it's divided up that students spend more time on academics, more time on enrichment, and then there's more time for teacher collaboration. So we were trying to do an impact and implementation study, which I'm pretty sure we screwed up in every possible way with respect to actually the deliverable piece and sort of the structure. So here's how we organized the study. We commissioned the tome, the 200-page tome that everyone does. And the problem was, so we had this elaborate, we had an IES grant, we had a ton of money, we were doing, the researchers, this is Apt Associates was doing the project. They were out in districts interviewing people, they did surveys of teachers and students and tons of data, which we never thought to ask them for during the course of the year. So we would have to wait till the school year went by, wait for the kids to take the MCAS test because we wanted to look at the academic outcomes, wait for the data to come back, wait for them to have time to analyze it, and write it up. So it's generally like January, February of the next school year when we have found out what happened the prior year. At which point, we have already given the schools the grants again. There's nothing we can do to change anything. And then everyone's like, well, that was last year's data, and we changed this thing, and so now this year it's going to be better. And then we also, could somebody get me a water, like refill my water? Be great. Thank you. We also set up the consents in a stupid way. So when teachers or students were participating in the survey, we had the consent written to say that we would only report back data at the program level, meaning the ELT program statewide. We could have written it to say we'll report back at the school level, and then we would have known, like, in each school. And so we're like, well, school A looks great, but we have no idea which, So, so it was really frustrating and it was just like not useful at all. So when we went to the next project with them was actually, they were also our evaluator on the educator evaluation project that I've been describing. Thank you so much. And in that case, I had learned my lesson. And so what we did was we set them up. Initially, actually, we had it just as like quarterly memos where they're just whatever their most recent data collection was, just report back on it quickly. We ultimately actually changed it to just be like, do your fall field survey and then report then, and then do your mid-year interviews and report then. And so we timed it directly to the data collection side rather than just quarterly, which was kind of arbitrary. And then in the final years, we actually said, actually stop writing these reports, these giant reports, and instead produce stuff that translates these findings for districts. So if you look at the latest deliverables from that, we did have them do one final kind of like ta-da, but like everything else is like 2 pagers for districts on like interesting examples of how a district implemented this piece of the law. So that's my preference, is to do something more like that. We did have a lot of resources on both of these projects, so it depends a bit on, how much time we have available, how much resources. It depends on the nature of the question. Like the charter school research, really that's mainly an MCAS analysis. Like at least I can't imagine sending Josh Angris to interview people in schools. So I think if I wanted an implementation piece on that, I would probably partner with somebody else because they're so quanty, So a bit has to do with the nature of the researcher. But to my mind, thank you, my ideal of the best study is one that has a nice design for impact analysis, ideally causal, but if not, something at least where there's a good relative to what, and something that's helping us iteratively improve. Because in the end, my job is improving education for kids and not doing the perfect research study. I do have actually 2 more slides. So I wanted to just make the point that the most useful research for me is something that has to do with Massachusetts, right? When I talk with districts, I have to push them or other states to be like, you're not so special. Like they all think they're very special, and they are special in their own special ways, but we can learn something. It doesn't have to be in Massachusetts. That being said, always that relevance piece is great. So we love to have stuff that's about Massachusetts. But really the best stuff is the stuff we do in partnership. So going back to this idea, that's really where we get the most value out of what we do. They're most meaningful to the program staff. You don't have to worry about the relevance because people are like, we asked you to do this. We want you to do this, right? Like it's part of our work. And I think that's really why the agency has invested in this function, is for that purpose. And so that's really how we get there. So that was the end of my prepared things. But I'm happy to have more comments or questions. So, yes?
This is maybe a little bit of a naive question. I'm thinking of a colleague who works in Baltimore Public Schools, and she's like responsible for college and career readiness, or some kind of very specific initiative like that. And I was wondering if you could comment from your perspective on the disadvantages of having these very sort of what seems to be sort of short-lived project-focused initiatives.
I think, part of working in a state agency or district is that, like, stuff just comes in that you have to do, right? So the legislature decides to change the bilingual ed law, and so you have a sort of initiative. The smart ones build that into what they're already doing and make it part of a strategic arc. So when I think about my colleagues who work on educator policy, educator evaluation built into educator preparation and built in, now they're really focusing on the curriculum side and how can we help improve teachers' effective use of curriculum. And so, yeah, there's individual projects, but they're building towards something. I don't know how common that is. I mean, I do have an exceptionally strategic group of people that I work with, so, but that to me would be the way to handle those sort of one-off things. But the legislature made us do a study on, what was it? Financial literacy. And that little program, they gave us like $4, right? They're like, here are your $4, and go work with a bunch of districts on financial literacy and do an evaluation. So like, okay, and so you do the best you can, but it's hard to kind of fit that into the broader strategy. But where you can find those opportunities, I think, is how to make that more useful. So, yeah.
You talked about how it sounds like the final documents that you're preparing are becoming more and more targeted towards districts and making it easy for districts to access and implement. I'm wondering if there are sort of other ways that you're seeing that expand in the 2017s, like interesting ways of presenting some of that data beyond, I guess, just like shorter reports.
Yeah, so this is, you guys should invite me back in like 2 years because I'll have a really good answer to this then. My office has historically, we've had a research and evaluation function and a strategic planning function, which is internally oriented. And we've just recently picked up this new chunk of work around, we're calling it resource use, but it's more district oriented. So it's more about using data and evidence and planning to influence district practice. So the policy brief is an example of that, these sort of practice-oriented deliverables coming out of research projects. But we also have leverage over things like the way our grant programs are structured. So we just issued some grants. We have a federal grant to support this for districts to look at some data. We came up with these really cool reports about things like class size and how it varies across districts, and the student learning experience ones I described are one of them. And to pick something that from the data that you have available to you and the evidence you know about the world appears to be a challenge in your district, pick something evidence-based to address that in some way, and then build some evidence about what you've done. And so we're trying to get at people getting better at using evidence that already exists, building evidence about what they're doing, which actually I think is more important than the using, and then sharing evidence with one another. And that's our strategy in that area. So we're relatively new at it, but that's kind of the direction we're going to hopefully help on the district side get a little closer to influencing practice. So,
How have you found over time people's responses, like different stakeholders' responses to efforts to gather data, studies, and those kinds of things?
My second favorite story regards, so we have, for the last couple of years, we have annually done a survey of superintendents and principals which is super helpful, actually. The program staff, I'm so lucky that I can go to my program staff and they can essentially design a survey. And I have a colleague who works on that with them. But so in the first year of this project, we wanted to also do a teacher survey because we thought it'd be useful to have all three perspectives on these various policy initiatives. Wow, that really failed. And the reason was teachers are just very suspicious of, and I'm not entirely sure it's all teachers, but the ones that the union represents and hears from frequently, or the unions, very suspicious that we're going to do something with these data. And it colossally failed. Like the union sent, one of the two state unions sent out missives to their membership, do not participate in the state survey. So they're not always the most receptive. But I think what I could have done differently there is work closer with the unions along the way. I think we were under a bit of time pressure for a variety of reasons, and we had connected with them some, but we didn't build the relationship in a way that would have made it feel comfortable for them. And they really wanted it to be a anonymous survey, and the way it was structured, we just couldn't do. I mean, it didn't have to be identifiable to us, but for the vendor, for a variety of reasons, it had to be identifiable, and that was a no-go. So there are things, I would do it differently if I were to try to do it. That being said, I was really surprised when we did this grant program. This is a bit of a big ask for districts, right? This is a very different way of thinking for some of them. And we were like, are we even going to get any applicants? But we got like 3 times as many applicants as the number we could actually fund, and a lot of really interesting ideas. So and they're very tactical. They're things like, are we using our paraprofessionals as effectively as we could? You know, we want to build out a STEM initiative in our middle school, and we need to shift resources because we don't have any middle school science right now. So how can we shift resources to build that in, because we know that's important? And so I feel like we're going to learn a lot tactically about how districts think about data and what they are and are not receptive to that will help us inform that work. Other questions?
Carrie, thanks very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.